Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. We're just going to hold on for a few seconds while everyone is let into the webinar. Great, I think that's most people here now. Welcome everyone to this first Creative Climate Literacy 101 webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Chiara, I work at Julie's Bicycle. Also with me on the call are Becky from Julie's Bicycle, who's going to be helping in the background with things like chat and Q&A, and also Farah from Julie's Bicycle, who's going to be silent but working away in the background as well to help anyone with technical issues. Just before we dive in, a really quick bit of housekeeping. Throughout the webinar, if you have a technical issue, you can use the chat to message Farah directly and she will follow up with you. She might appear under the name Julie's Bicycle. If you have a question about content, there's a Q&A icon at the bottom or the top of the Zoom window. It depends a little bit on how your window is laid out, but it says Q&A. You can click on that and type and send your question to us. That means we'll have all the questions in one place at the end and can go through as many of them as possible. If there are any left over, we will try and answer them in a follow-up blog post or possibly in a follow-up webinar. We will also be recording this webinar and posting it on the Julie's Bicycle website once its subtitles and slides are going to be sent out to all of you. So thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the first one of these introductory webinars on creative climate action. We've organized them because we know that for a lot of people, coming to climate change for the first time can feel quite daunting. And even if you've been taking environmental action for a while, it can sometimes be useful to get a bit of a refresher or hear someone else explain some of the issues to get some inspiration for how to take it back to your teams, people you work with, audiences. And we thought we would run them in the current moment because it's sort of such a huge break from normal that we'll be rebuilding from for a long time, and how we rebuild and what we invest in as we rebuild is going to lock us into a path for a lot of years to come. And that's why you might have heard people speaking about a green recovery and what that looks like. We'll also be repeating today's webinar next week. There are a few spaces left, so if you want to encourage anyone you work with to sign up after this, please feel free to do so. I think we're also trialing streaming the webinar to YouTube at the same time. And at the end of these webinars, we'll also be asking you to help decide topics for 2 more webinars that will take a bit of a deeper dive into specific topics. You can save those dates now on the 2nd and 9th of July at the same time. Just before we move on, I thought it might be useful to get a bit of a sense of who all is here. So I am just going to run a quick poll. And if you could take just a minute or so to select what best describes your role. Great. So thanks so much for everyone filling that in. So it looks like most of you here work at an Arts Council England funded organisation and are responsible for fulfilling the environmental reporting requirements, but don't otherwise engage much with environmental action at your organisations. Brilliant. That's great. That's exactly why we're doing these. So this webinar is supported through that Arts Council England environmental programme. So as we've just seen, pretty much everyone is going to know some or all of this, but if you just bear with me, I'll just kick off with a really, really quick introduction to Judy's Bicycle and the programme. So we were established more than 10 years ago to support the creative community to take action on the climate and ecological crises. We work across different parts of the creative community to do that around skills and training, so building environmental literacy and skills, business and operations, helping organizations to be greener, from changing light bulbs to bringing the environment into missions and values. Creativity, helping to spark creative programming and expression on environment and climate change, and strategy and policy, how that's translated and supported through cultural policy, regional and national policy, investment and funding principles. And we do all of that because we really want to see an arts and creative community that actively works in and contributes to a just society that lives within the ecological boundaries of our planet. And so the Arts Council England reporting programme is a really big part of that. We've been partnered with Arts Council England to deliver this programme since 2012. And through that partnership, we help Arts Council funded organisations report on annual environmental impacts and to take action. And with all of that data that people submit, we analyse it and we feed it back to the sector to understand where we can prioritise action and where else support is needed. So you can find more information on that in the latest annual report, which also has lots and lots of case studies in it. And that's available on the Judy's Bicycle website or on the Arts Council website. And we found that over the course of the programme, engagement with environmental sustainability has led to energy efficiency and carbon reductions, more resilience in the sector, so things like reduced costs from energy bills, and a huge amount of benefits beyond carbon, so new creative opportunities, improved well-being and team morale, so staff being happy about taking environmental action, business planning, new partnerships and collaborations, and different ways of thinking really about how arts organisations relate to their local and global communities and reputational benefits. Sorry about that, I have a phantom doorbell in the background. The data you provide does also help us better understand the carbon footprint of the arts in the UK. And sorry about that. It isn't actually my doorbell. I have a broken doorbell that occasionally just rings. So a carbon footprint is basically the measure of the climate change impact of an activity, a product, a person, a country, venue, event, and so on and so forth. And when we're talking about climate change impact, what we're really talking about is greenhouse gas emissions. Again, some of you might know this, bear with me if you do. But for those who don't, greenhouse gases are gases in our atmosphere that trap heat. That's why they're called greenhouse gases, because it works like a greenhouse. Sort of lower concentrations in the atmosphere, they are actually what helps keep Earth warm enough for us to survive. So they help regulate temperatures. But what we've been doing since the start of the industrial age is putting more and more and more greenhouse gases, mainly carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere, which means they're trapping more and more heat, which is causing global warming, which is destabilizing our climate. So just before we go on, there is a right answer to this, but please don't worry if you don't get it right, because that's why we're here. So I just wonder if you could let me know what you think is the biggest source of man-made greenhouse gas emissions in the world. That's some fairly split results. So those of you who said electricity and heat would have been correct on this one. In terms of global emissions from all across the world, electricity and heat is the source of most of our greenhouse gas emissions. It's around a third, even more if you count the energy that's used in manufacturing and construction. Transportation is around 16% of our emissions, and agriculture is around 12%. Land use change, so things like deforestation, is around 6 to 7%. Of course, a lot of these things kind of interact with each other. So there's your direct emissions from agriculture, and then there is also the transport that gets used in agriculture. There's, deforestation that gets caused by agriculture. So sometimes when you're looking at emissions figures, one of the questions you can ask yourself is what is included in this figure and what is not included. So you start understanding what exactly people are talking about with a bit more detail, because that can kind of either hide or obscure or tell a very different story depending on what is included. But electricity and heat, which are generated from fossil fuels, which cause a lot of carbon emissions, are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So climate change impact is really how much greenhouse gases is this activity or this project or this event or this thing producing. And these are some of the main greenhouse gases that are regulated under international policy. So the first one is carbon dioxide. It's the most important greenhouse gas. Most of this comes from us burning fossil fuels for energy, for electricity, heat, transport, manufacturing, constructions. And basically over millions of years, plants used the sun's energy to capture this carbon from the air, and then they were buried, turned into fossil fuels. And now in a few short decades, we're using all of that energy, which is in some ways allowing us to do amazing things. But it also means that we're releasing all of that stored carbon back into the air on really short timelines. And that's what's unbalancing our climate. Some carbon emissions do also come from land use change. So things like forests being cut down, and also some industrial processes like cement manufacture, which produce carbon dioxide directly through one of the chemical reactions in the production stages. Then there's methane, which is a lot stronger than carbon dioxide, but it only stays in the atmosphere for about 10 years before it gets reabsorbed by natural processes. And so that methane comes from leaks from fossil fuel production, so leaks from things like gas wells, things like cow farts, which we hear about a lot, and methane is also released from food and other organic matter decomposing in landfills, and from flooded rice fields, where again, the organic matter that's decomposing in the wet is releasing methane. Then there's nitrous oxide, which is super strong. There's not a lot of it about, but it's generally released from the soil and the way we manage that soil, including how much fertilizer is used. So that's when people talk about better methods of agriculture, they're usually talking about how you manage nitrous oxide as well, and of course methane. And then there are F gases, which are man-made replacements for gases that were destroying the ozone layer. And they're used in things like refrigerants in fridges, air conditioning, aerosols, fire retardants. So they were kind of a good idea to start with when we were trying to stop the hole in the ozone layer from expanding. But it turns out a lot of them are really good at trapping heat in the atmosphere. And that's one of the reasons why these products and how we dispose of them are so highly regulated. It's to prevent F gases from escaping into the atmosphere. And then lastly, when we talk about carbon footprints, you'll often see the unit CO2e, which stands for carbon dioxide equivalent. It basically means that the warming power of the other greenhouse gases has been converted into carbon to try and help us capture and compare the climate impact of different types of greenhouse gas making activities. But I think the thing, when you get, when it starts feeling a bit complicated, I think the thing that really matters and that you can keep coming back to is carbon dioxide, and that burning of fossil fuels for energy. Carbon is sort of the most important greenhouse gas, both because of how much we're putting out there, but also because the temperature changes it's causing, they more or less can't be reversed or undone through natural processes on a timescale that's relevant to human society. Once that carbon is in the atmosphere, it more or less stays there, or once that extra carbon is in the atmosphere, it more or less stays there. So where are we now in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? All of these extra emissions mean that global heating has already reached 1 degree above where we were, above pre-industrial levels. 1 or 2 degrees might not seem like much, but our complex, quite interconnected society hasn't existed outside those temperature bounds. So the graph that I've put in here shows our agricultural society, which started 10,000-ish years ago. That's what's labeled as the Holocene in that graph. And in all that time, temperatures have been really stable, and it's one of the reasons we've managed to build this really connected society. And so the risk is, if we move outside those temperature bounds, we don't really know how our society is going to that. And another thing to know is that average warming of 1 degree or 1.5 or 2 is not the same everywhere across the world. So temperatures increase at different speeds in different places. For example, there's more warming over land, which happens to be where we live. So the Paris Agreement is an international agreement that most governments in the world are signed up to limit warming to below 2 degrees or better yet 1.5 degrees. And that more ambitious 1.5 degree target was introduced actually quite late in negotiations. At that point, scientists hadn't studied the difference that half a degree would make, but it was pushed mainly by low-lying island states and other nations from the global south who knew that half a degree would make a huge difference to their people, and in some cases, whether their countries might go underwater or not. Every fraction of a degree really does matter. So scientists then went away and studied the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And that's the famous report that came out at the end of 2018 by something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which tries to summarize all the climate science there is for policymakers. And that was one of the things that really sparked headlines around the world, around how urgent we need climate action at this point. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees in terms of global warming is that the proportion of people in the world who are exposed to heat waves could double, the average drought length doubles, the proportion of people in the world exposed to water scarcity doubles, habitat loss doubles. You know, at 1.5 degrees, tropical corals survive. At 2 degrees, they disappear. And so one way to think about it as well is climate change is a risk multiplier. We control how many emissions go into the atmosphere. Those emissions cause higher temperature, and those cause changing weather patterns, which then cause more flooding, droughts, food insecurities, displacement of people. And some of those consequences are predictable, but some of them are also unpredictable. So this is also a question about how resilient our political, economic, social, and cultural systems really are to deal with these risks, which is a question that I think the current situation with the coronavirus is also asking of us at this moment. And that's why when we talk about climate change, we're not really just talking about an abstract geographic problem. It really intersects with everything else, whether that's women's access to education, whether it's health and well-being of communities. The most disadvantaged people in the world who are generally responsible for the least emissions are also the most vulnerable to its impacts across the world. Not just people in the global south, but also people who are less well off or who are already hit by other inequalities here in the global north. Whether that's, you know, who can afford to run the air conditioning during a heat wave, who is most likely to live next to polluting industries, and that tends to be communities of color, it tends to be people in lower incomes. Which is one of the reasons why the more we look at climate change as this cross-cutting issue, I think the more relevant it becomes to us and our communities, and also to the way that we run our organizations and businesses. Because it's the question of what difference we want to make in our own communities. So where are we going at the moment? We are, despite having an international agreement, we're still quite a long way from limiting warming to 1.5 degrees or let alone 2 degrees. At the moment, we're on a pathway to more than 3 degrees of warming. current rates of warming, we're going to get to 1.5 degrees well within the next 3 decades. So this IPCC report that came out in 2018 as well told us that we have until 2050 at the very latest to reach net zero emissions globally. So that's across the whole world. Getting us back on track to a 2-degree trajectory aiming for 1.5 is only possible if we start reducing now and reduce global emissions by half by 2030. Which is why the current 10 years are crucial, because really the decisions that we make as businesses and as people and as countries in these 10 years are going to lock in what happens. And the reason this is so urgent is because, as we talked about earlier, carbon dioxide sort of accumulates in the atmosphere over time. It stays there. It's a problem of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So as long as our emissions are not down to net zero, we're still actually increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is why even this year, with the pause in emissions that's caused by the current coronavirus pause, that has caused a dip in emissions, but by the end of the year, the actual concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere are still going to have gone up. And if we want to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, we have a so-called carbon budget, which is roughly how much more carbon dioxide we can put in the atmosphere. And every delay in cutting emissions means deeper and faster cuts are going to be needed, because we'll have used up more of our remaining carbon budget and will depend more on so-called negative emissions technologies, which are things like capturing carbon through nature and technology, which I'll get to in 2 seconds. But it also means there's going to be a higher risk of overshooting tipping points, and adaptation to impacts becomes a lot more difficult. So there's a human cost attached to every delay. In a lot of ways, if we are talking about climate change as a problem that's coming, that means we are incredibly privileged, because climate change and its consequences are already here for a huge number of people all across the world. When we talk about net zero, what we mean is that we reduce our emissions by as much as possible and use so-called negative emissions to sort of balance out the rest. Negative emissions can be from nature, so things like planting trees, restoring peatlands, or they can be technological, like something called carbon capture and storage, or stuff that sucks carbon directly from the atmosphere. Where models see a role for these technologies is usually to help address emissions from areas that are harder for us to deal with and reduce, like flying. But what we can't do is use this possibility of the negative emissions as a reason to not reduce them in the first place. There's a limited role for these technologies, because there's a limit to how much they can do, because we don't have infinite land to plant infinite trees on, and the kind of technological solutions that we're talking about, they don't exist at scale. So we can't depend on them to do the really big emissions cuts. So there are a few key policies that govern the UK's climate action. The first one is the Paris Agreement, which we've talked about, and as part of that, the UK has to submit a so-called nationally determined contribution plan for how it's going to reduce emissions. Every country has to submit one of these. These are the plans that at the moment put us on a trajectory to 3 degrees, which is one of the reasons that next year's climate negotiations are so important, because at the moment countries have to submit more ambitious plans to help close that gap and get us more onto a path to 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. We also have the UK Climate Change Act, which was originally introduced in 2008. Last year, the government updated the legally binding targets of the Climate Change Act to net zero emissions by 2050. And that's a start, but there is a question about whether it's enough. So if we have to get to global net zero emissions by 2050, there is a question about how these cuts should be distributed. And there's a really strong case from an equity perspective that high emitters and industrialized countries who've contributed the majority of historical emissions, like the UK, should get to net zero much, much faster than the rest of the world, a decade or more faster, by 2030. And that would mean a lot steeper emissions reductions and a lot faster emissions reductions, faster than have been achieved by any country. Which is where this call for a lot more ambition is coming from. So everything does matter, and it's not just about that target itself, but whether the policy and action are there to make reductions happen. We could also have the most ambitious target in the world, but it doesn't mean much without a plan of how we get there. So there's a thing called the Committee on Climate Change, which is the body that's tasked to oversee how the UK government is delivering against the Climate Change Act. And they've told us that we're not on track to meet the targets of the Climate Change Act. They have developed a roadmap of how we can get to net zero by 2050, and we'll get to that shortly. Alongside this, more than 450 UK borough, city and county councils have declared a climate emergency, and different cities are setting ambitious targets and action plans. We've got, Manchester's zero carbon by 2038 to Cornwall's carbon neutral by 2030. And a lot of those councils are doing a lot of citizen engagement and consultation, and at the moment publishing their roadmaps for how they want to actually achieve those targets. And underpinning all of those are these concepts of the just transition and the Green New Deal. So how we create a kind of policy and mobilize an investment that leaves absolutely nobody behind. So that, for example, people who are working in high carbon industries don't just lose their jobs, but actually get given jobs in the way that we transition to a low carbon or zero carbon economy, and making sure that the costs of all of that transition are not borne by those in society who are least able to pay them. So how are we doing against our plans at the moment? We have made a huge progress in decarbonising the UK's electricity grid. Through that, the UK has seen one of the fastest decarbonisations of any sort of global north nation in the world. And what that does mean is that the progress we've made in reducing emissions from that electricity generation has kind of helped to mask failures in other sectors. So while emissions from electricity have dropped really quickly, they pretty much have not budged in other sectors like transport and agriculture, which is why transport is now in the UK pretty much the highest source of emissions. There's also a new study by WWF and the University of Leeds that came out earlier this year, and they looked at what is captured in the official UK emissions, the official government figures, because of the way that the scopes of what is included in a country's emissions is agreed. So all the emissions that are associated with all the stuff we consume that's imported from elsewhere, and the emissions from flying are not included in our national figures. That's because they would be included in the countries, for example, where the stuff is manufactured, because that's where the factories are located. And flying is generally looked at on a global scale rather than individual countries because of historic challenges of, okay, who has to count the flying emissions? Is it the country the airline is headquartered in? Is it where we're flying to or from? But what that means is that if we include those emissions, we've actually reduced only by about 15% by 1990, not by more than 40%. So these are some of the headlines of what needs to happen from the Committee on Climate Change roadmap. And I've highlighted a few of those that are really relevant to us as creative businesses. We have to decarbonize electricity, so that means more renewable energy. We have to invest in energy efficiency for buildings and shift away from gas heating through things like heat pumps. By the 2030s, there should be widespread electrification of heating. So it's potentially unlikely in the current moment, but if you are doing any big capital projects in terms of future-proofing buildings, that's a really important thing to consider. Getting people to use more public transport, walk and cycle more. There's also a big growth for electric vehicles, and that's relevant in terms of providing car charging points for audiences and thinking ahead if you'll be replacing any vehicles. And this isn't explicitly mentioned here, but of course there also needs to be a shift in how we use diesel generators at things like events. Can we use more mains grid connections, more battery power? There's energy and resource efficiency by businesses, so basically using less Reducing food waste is a really big one, and especially stopping sending any food waste to landfill where it produces methane. Healthier diets, so a shift away from meat. How could we support that culturally through the kind of food we serve in our spaces and at our events? How could we support things like tree planting? And then the second part of the roadmap here, constrained demand growth for aviation basically means we can't just keep flying more and more. So thinking about when and why we fly as a sector, reducing waste overall, and again, sending no biodegradable waste to landfill. So that's food, paper, card, plants, organic waste. So government can kind of set the overall policy trajectory that helps make those changes and make sure that investment happens. But more than half of emissions reductions are going to require some kind of change from people and impact the way we live, like the shift to electric vehicles, like the choices about what we eat. So culturally, there is a huge opportunity for the arts here as well in helping shift the barriers to what people will accept and helping to model some of those shifts and make them feel more real. So, you know, why culture and the arts? I think everyone here will have their own really strong feeling. It's why we work in the arts, but just how we transmit and use some of those roles and link them to the climate crisis, I think is one of the big creative challenges and ethical challenges for the sector at the moment. You know, we are part of human experience. We can bring communities together, empower, educate, inspire, provide space to reflect, to critique, interrogate, learn, to make. How do we motivate citizenship and activism and driving positive change? Can we be catalysts for innovation? So testing grounds for new technologies, new business models. How do we use our voice as part of the economic sector to influence? You know, we are a massive repository of knowledge as well, and cultural knowledge. What is in there that we can use to help us through this transition? And then also our venues, our museums, our libraries, our events as physical hubs and spaces. Again, how do we reduce impacts from those and role model kind of the low carbon infrastructure that we need? So some of the drivers for change, just in summary, we have legislation like the Climate Change Act. We have regulations like Arts Council England's Environmental Reporting Programme, climate emergency declarations, so how local authorities are going to translate those, public pressure from things like the school strikes for climate, and a question of resilience, how we build organizations that are fit for the future and ready to face and adapt to coming changes, changing climate, changing public opinion, changing policy, economic, like energy, in some areas like energy efficiency, and you know, reducing waste, that is going to save money. In other areas, there are going to need to be investments and how we think of that as a sector, and making sure that where we do make capital investments, that they're fit for the future. Peer pressure and pressure from our partners, the artists we work with, others in the creative community, internal pressure from teams and workforce who are worried about the climate crisis and want to do something. And ethics as well, you know, what does it really mean for the arts to be a driver for good in the world in the context of the climate crisis? How does it shift our social contract when we consider how to build a society within the ecological boundaries of the planet? One way to think about action can be this idea of spheres of influence and control. So what is it that you control directly? Where can you focus on reducing emissions in your own operations, like how much time you dedicate to energy management in your venue, or whether you make an investment into LED lights, or how you route that tour, who your energy supplier is. There's what you can influence. So, you know, the contracts that you have with suppliers, how you work with your partners, whether you bundle things like coach tickets with festival tickets to push people to travel by coach instead of driving. And lastly, there's the stuff that you can't control or influence directly, but that impacts your ability to take action. So things like how much local investment is being made into public transport infrastructure, and how can you support the conversation in the public sphere about these. So these are some kind of headlines about what zero carbon culture might mean. So less energy, zero carbon energy sources for cultural buildings and events, a circular creative economy, replacing take, make, dispose model with one that designs out waste, sustainable and zero carbon travel and transport, less meat and dairy, protecting and enhancing nature, looking at divesting from fossil fuels, things like banking and investment and pensions, a new creative ecology, like what are the green and sustainable products and services that we need, working together with others to find better solutions, and crucially engaging audiences, visitors, your local policymakers, your local community to inspire action on climate and the environment. In terms of a few other principles for taking action and translating this into your work, the emphasis is going to depend on what your role is, and that's why it's useful to keep this idea of what do you control, what do you influence, and how do you speak outwards in your mind, because it applies to your own role as well. If you have an organizational policy or strategy, look to the priorities in that and how the work in your department can support it. If you don't have one, start with your own department and go speak to others at the organization. Quite often we find that different departments like facilities, marketing and programming aren't really speaking to each other, and that means a lot of opportunities for action are missed. So under this idea of commitment, it's what is the policy and action plan? How are we embedding sustainability in decision-making processes? Do we have green champions? Can we create a designated budget? How do we influence and engage our artists, our partners, audiences and suppliers? What are our targets? What do we want to achieve and why? What's our vision? Under understanding, it's measuring and monitoring impacts. It's that data collection, how we use it to help inform our commitments. It's things like surveys of audiences, it's understanding what your partners would like to see or could use help with, measuring and monitoring impacts, and also understanding where you can make a difference. Under improvement, there's translation into action. So what is the action you actually take, and making sure that you keep on track to what you want to achieve. And under communicate, we've got talking about what you're doing, making it visible and felt, activating people for action as well. If they come into your spaces, what are the things that you want them to do? And if it ever feels overwhelming, again, here's something else that can be quite useful to think about and to help inform action. So measuring, again, to understand and report impacts, track how you're doing, figure out what information is meaningful and how you're tracking it. Don't go overboard, find the KPIs that are most useful to you, find the indicators that are most useful to you. If you're a venue, it probably is energy use in your building. It is how people are getting to your space. If you're an individual artist, it might just be tracking how many flights that you're taking a year, and which ones you can reduce. It might be tracking your mileage. Don't go massively overboard, but do find the main things that are meaningful. Avoid emissions by doing things differently. That includes, looking at changing business models, avoiding unnecessary travel, reducing emissions by increasing efficiency, things like energy efficiency, fuel efficiency, replacing high carbon energy sources with low carbon energy sources. That replacing as well in terms of the hierarchy, if you're thinking about materials, reduce how much you use first and then go into the fancy replacements that are more sustainable. And lastly, offsetting, we're about to put out a briefing to think about how we consider offsetting. It should always be a last resort and only used if you're confident that you're also managing and reducing your carbon footprint in other ways. And you can do it either through, official offsets, but it might also be a more DIY approach by making a donation or an investment into a cause or a project or a campaign that is driving climate action. Everyone in an organization has a role to play, whether that's setting policy and strategic plan and priorities and creating budgets and fundraising at senior management, working with policy makers and lobbying for change, operations, kind of action plans for day-to-day energy and resource management, piloting new technologies, sharing, learning with others, creative programming, so how we explore these themes in our creative programming or create the space for others too, which doesn't just have to be a climate play. I think where we're at the moment, some of these themes naturally come through, so it's how we create the space that allows that to happen. Creating new partnerships with environmental, climate, community organizations, amplifying voices that are not traditionally heard in the environmental movement, food and beverage, increasing plant-based menu options, reducing waste, Production and design, considering at the start what's going to happen at the end, designing for reuse, sourcing secondhand, repurposed, refurbished. Marketing and communications, again, how do you tell your organization's environmental story? How do you bring people in? How do you create a voice for your organization on these climate and environmental issues in your community and help drive this forward? Some food for thought. Don't let perfect be the enemy of action. This is a process and we won't get everything right all the time. Sometimes you won't have all the answers. Don't let that stop you from doing something. Ask follow-up questions if you're not certain about something. You know, if someone says this is environmentally friendly, ask how so? Biodegradable, under what conditions? Recyclable, does that mean it's commonly recycled? Can your waste management company recycle it? Better for the environment, better than what? So by asking those questions, you can start building a better understanding and hopefully finding your way through some greenwash that can be out there. Be honest, be transparent, accountable, and open. You know, share with others, share where you're at, say that this is a process. Have it as a conversation. And in terms of fundraising and budgets, how do we start building this in? You know, having a ring-fenced green fund is great, but just as important is looking at aligning your existing projects and budgets. Across the board, that might be creative budgets, it might be operational budgets, so that we don't see it as an obligation or an extra thing, but actually see it as the creative challenge that it is to realign what we're for and how we serve our communities. Some resources for action. We have the free Creative Green tools, which those of you doing Arts Council reporting will know. We have a lot of free guides on the JB website, from the museum's environmental framework, the sustainable production guide, webinars, practical guides on everything from audience travel to energy management. If you work for an event, the Show Must Go On report on outdoor event impacts and sort of where we're at. We've also just launched our Creative Climate Chats, which take place every Wednesday, sort of in conversation about issues like the green recovery and just transition. We had our first one with Lucy Davies from the Royal Court Theatre yesterday, and we have one next week with Chaitanya Kumar from the New Economics Foundation. Join Season for Change, which is run by G's Bicycle and Arts Admin. It's a UK-wide season of creative programming celebrating the environment and inspiring action on climate change. We're reshaping it at the moment, given the current context, but there will be a digital element and hopefully next year a physical element to it as well. Go to the Season for Change website to find out more, and listen to the first series of the Colour Green podcast, which features Baroness Lola Young in conversation with artists and activists of colour on issues like climate justice, race, power and inequality. I will whiz through a couple of stories of action from the sector to inspire you, and then go to questions. You can always find more stories on the JB website. So first off, we've got the Royal Court Theatre. It's sort of credible plan for a just transition to carbon net zero through 2020 that they published last year, or earlier this year. So they looked at everything from, you know, on-site renewable energy and heat pumps, which at the moment isn't feasible. So they're focusing on reduction targets instead and buying 100% renewable electricity from good energy. They're reducing the meat on their menu to 47% to 25%, favouring less carbon intensive meats and fish. So moving away from things like beef. They've commissioned a carbon costing of menu items that they're going to share publicly on their menus, looking at zero waste to landfill, no flights within mainland UK, and a decision matrix for international travel for staff and artists to take into account the environmental impact of our flights, and looking at slower production design and build timelines to help us be more circular in how we use materials. The Horniman Museum and Gardens also recently announced their strategy, so they're looking at switching to a green electricity tariff within the year. A Nature and Love project to redisplay their collections to bring out ecological and climate themes. Creating an environmental champions club to inspire visitors to make their own changes. They've created a new role of a climate and ecological action coordinator to carry this through, and introducing a new planting scheme for biodiversity in the gardens. The Grand Theatre in Blackpool have published this lovely infographic about what they've done, looking at, transferring prints to digital, looking at reducing their carbon footprint through things like energy savings. So their bottle fridges are now fitted with timers. They're fitting motion sensors to control the lights and other initiatives across the theatre. We've got our Spotlight programme, which is looking at a pathway to zero carbon cultural buildings. So looking at using energy as efficiently as possible, electrifying buildings. So again, switching from gas to heat pumps and using green electricity that is either generated on site or procured or bought externally. The Manchester Art Sustainability team have been doing amazing work in Manchester for many years and are looking at how they, as a network of cultural and arts organisations in Manchester, ranging from the BBC and ITV offices to small galleries, can support Manchester's zero carbon to 2038 roadmap and ambition, and how they work in their spaces. And they're now also working on a European Urbact transfer network to actually share what they've learned as a cultural network, working with their city with other cities across Europe. There's an example from the new Carnival Company. So they're in Isle of Wight, Mardi Gras, who work a lot with the area of outstanding natural beauty that's located there, and theming that. So their theme last year was Biosphere Island. And so part of that is that the participating schools are required to partner with a local environmental organization to learn about and then creatively present work. And a lot of the way they think of their carnival is really about celebrating that area of natural beauty. Here's an example from Shambhala Festival. They've done a lot over the years from renewable energy and so on and so forth, but I wanted to focus in on their meat and fish free initiative that they introduced in 2016. They decided to go entirely meat and fish free because they'd done a lot behind the scenes on, again, things like switching to waste vegetable oil biofuel, bringing in reusable cups, running a bring your own bottle campaign that's been going for more than 5 years. And it felt strange to not tackle food. So they prepared quite a long FAQ section about their choices and the science behind diet and climate change. And they had a lot of people on hand to open it up as a conversation, and they framed it very much as a conversation. And the money that they saved, for example, on providing meat and crew catering was instead put to making a broader selection of stuff available to everyone, like smoothies in the morning. So to help kind of help everyone get on board with that shift. In the post-festival survey that they sent out, 77% of respondents wanted the festival to stay meat and fish free. That's actually gone up since then. They still ask the question. And more than 50% of people who were meat eaters who took the survey reported that they changed their diet and reduced their meat intake after their experience at the festival. So that's how what we do in our spaces can help percolate through elsewhere. There's the Lambeth Country Show as an event in London and Brixton, who are again doing a lot of work working with their traders on making sure that they get things like sustainable food packaging, and they're also working a lot with Lambeth Council on spreading their sort of good practice to other country shows. On the creative side, it's an example from Arts Catalyst. So they have a project called Test Sites that brings together the local community with artists, scientists, and other experts at different sites. One of those is the Yorkshire Calder Valley, which has a history of flooding and things like water pollution. So they're really getting people in to talk about how water is managed locally through workshops, water testings, walks, all about sparking that conversation about how we manage local water systems. And at the moment, they're trying to pull together everything that they've learned into this idea of a people's water policy. What would it look like if people who live here have a bigger voice and a more creative voice in how all of this is managed? And an example of an individual sort of artist and theatre maker doing something. So Toby was one of the participants in our Creative Climate Leadership course. And as an individual theatre maker thinking about how he can make a difference, you know, he's really trying to use his voice and influencing the partners that he works with. So he has a document called the Principles of Peach that he shares with venues and organizations that he works with to open up a conversation about environmental issues, but also things like accessibility, supporting diverse recruitment and voices, supporting fair and equal pay. So he uses that document, which you can see and actually look at on his website, to open up that conversation, hopefully, again, create ripple effects. So just before we go to questions, I'd like you to take 2 minutes from all of this whistle-stop tour about climate and environment and how we're different bits of the arts are responding, to write down one thing you're going to do when you go back to work. And then also something from this presentation you're going to speak to someone about. It could be someone you work with, it could be, you know, a partner, it could be someone in your local authority. Just write down something you're going to speak to someone about and who you're going to speak to. And if you can, and if you've written down your 2 things, I would also encourage you, if you can, to put something in your calendar now, both now, this week or next week, to follow up. And if you can, about a month from now, put in a 15-minute reflection moment about whether you've done what you've just pledged to do, what the next step is, whether there's anything else that you'd like to learn about. And just before we go to questions, as I know some of you might need to leave, I would also love it if you could quickly fill in this poll about future webinar topics. If there's something else that you would like to see us address in one of these future deep dive webinars, just put it into the chat. Brilliant. So it looks like there's quite a resounding winner here on writing an environmental policy and action plan. What we will also try and do is pull together a few of the resources that are out there on some of the other topics and share those with you so that you can deep dive yourself. Thank you. We have a few minutes left for questions. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box and type it to us. Great. So someone has asked in terms of having a blended work approach where staff will work from home, and how to capture the carbon footprint from domestic heating and light, and how we're going to do that and support reduction of carbon footprints in home working, which is a great point to raise. Us at JB as well, I think we're moving to a more distributed home working model. I think one of the key things that we can share with you is our partners, Good Energy, have actually shared some tips for home working with us that we can send out a link to as well in the follow-up to this webinar. And I think us at JB, we're going to look at how we support everyone who's reporting to capture some of those impacts in a way that is meaningful and doesn't become, again, a bit too arduous if you're trying to chase down, 20 employees for bits of their energy bills, which might also not be the most practical use of time. So someone has asked about electric vehicles, whether they're that positive in the fight against emissions or just a slightly better alternative. So there have been some life cycle analyses that have been done, and electric cars they do over their lifetime very much undo, for example, the impact of when they're produced. So in some ways, yes, they are a really key part of our fight against emissions. And there is still, and one of the ways that the UK is planning to expand its electricity grid is also to help accommodate that need for more electricity to be generated. So if we have an electricity grid that's powered by renewables, and that's what we're charging our electric cars from, then absolutely it makes a positive impact. One of the other challenges is, though, that the number of miles that we have traveled by car has gone up in the UK over the past decade or so. So there is also, at some point, we are going to have to consider that we might not be able to just switch over one for one to electric cars, but they are a really, really big part of the solution. Someone has asked whether I believe that individual initiatives can affect change, or whether all creative sector organizations need to demand policy change. It's interesting because we sometimes see this idea of individual action and systemic policy changes as being in conflict, and actually we need both. They both feed into each other. I think as an individual organization or something you do individually, there's a limit to the emissions reductions that you can achieve with that. But by doing it, what you're doing is you're sending the signals to others that this is something you care about. And also in some ways demanding that big policy change is also individual action. It takes us individually through our workplaces to step forward and ask for that change. Any collective change is still made up of an endless number of individuals coming together and doing something and asking for more. Someone has asked that going by the net zero plans by 2050, does that mean if it's achieved, the climate heat would still be current levels 1 degree above industrial levels? For the foreseeable future, yes. Once the atmosphere has heated, it is very, very difficult to undo that without, again, huge projects to remove carbon from the atmosphere again, which is why it's so important that we reduce emissions now. A big question on how we balance financial loss and not shooting our environmental impact back up to where it was pre-COVID when we reopen our venues and start touring again. I think that's something that is a big worry at the moment. In some ways, the last financial crash in 2008 took us back about 10 years. We were just starting to catch up to where we were on environmental action before this happened. I think one of the only ways that we can make sure that we don't go back to what it was when we reopen our venues again is by using our voices and supporting these calls for a green recovery. So again, the environmental movement at the moment is talking to government about how we make sure that any investment that goes into restarting the economy comes with so-called green strings attached. Someone has mentioned community energy. For sure, we can share a bit about that. So community energy projects are basically community owned and invested in renewable energy installations. And I think there is a huge opportunity for arts organizations, especially those that have space, to work with their communities on installing those. How is a carbon footprint measured in everyday language? So there are there are things called carbon conversion factors, which already is an everyday language, I will grant you. But they come, the ones that we use are published by government, and they are calculated based on research and much bigger data sets. So the carbon conversion factor, for example, for a unit of electricity is calculated on the basis of all the ways that that electricity has been generated. So on a yearly basis, someone will sit somewhere and look at how much coal energy went into the grid, how much gas went into the grid, how much renewables went into the grid. And on that basis, calculate what the emissions are from all the energy that was generated and divide that by kilowatt hours. So you come up with this, how many kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent are linked to the use of 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. Some carbon conversion factors are pretty easy to understand, and they're pretty constant. So we know more or less how much carbon is generated when we burn a liter of fuel. Where it gets more complicated is questions around what is the carbon footprint of, say, a tomato, because that carbon footprint of that tomato actually depends a bit on where it was grown, how that soil was managed, how efficient was the farm machinery, was it grown in a greenhouse which uses electricity, how far was it transported to get to you. And that's why the further away you move from energy, the more you're slightly depending on assumptions, which doesn't mean that that data is not valuable in and of itself, because it can help you identify the hotspots. But it does mean it can be useful, again, to ask those questions of what has been included in this carbon footprint. Has transport been included? What hasn't been included? We will share these slides, yes. So also a question about, following on from the question about the long-term impact of electric vehicles, when we talk about electrifying buildings and transport, is that electricity generated from renewables or fossil fuels? That's both need to happen. So the UK electricity grid already has quite a lot of renewables in it. We need to go further. And again, that's why a lot of the plans for sort of the whole system plans for this are about how we have to change the grid overall, which means adding a lot more renewable energy generation capacity. Because when we electrify heating and transport, it means we're going to need more electricity overall, because all that energy that was being generated by gas, we're effectively changing over to be from electricity. Which is why it goes hand in hand with things like energy efficiency as well. Because if we are more efficient about how much energy we need to use, we need to heat our buildings, that means that we have to generate less renewable energy to cover that heating. I hope that was not too garbled. But basically any plan, the nationwide plan is we have to generate more energy, and we have to generate it from renewable sources. Because in the long term, we can decarbonize the electricity grid. We can change how electricity is generated. Decarbonizing gas at scale is much, much more difficult. There will be and is a limited supply of green gas, which is generated from things like landfill, but it's ultimately easier to make electricity from renewable energy than it is to create a green gas supply that is large enough to meet all the needs that we have. I think someone's asked, what is the impact of emailing? So an individual email is really difficult to get an accurate figure for, because it depends on, do you count the energy use of your computer? Do you count the transmission network? And do you count the servers? And all of that, in some ways, comes back to how is our electricity generated, which is why renewables are so important. Yeah. So someone's also asked, what is renewable energy? So renewable energy is energy that is generated from things like wind, from solar power, from hydropower. So that means flowing water, basically. So sources that are renewable rather than fossil fuels, which are not renewable. Fossil fuels is things like coal and gas. So I think that's probably it for questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining at the moment. Sorry for the questions that we didn't get to, but thank you so much for everyone giving us their time. Please do stay tuned in to the Judy's Bicycle newsletter if you can, where we'll share more events and resources. Do look at the Judy's Bicycle website under the resources section. You might have to use the search function to find specific things as well. And we look forward to staying in touch with all of you.